His name was on his wrist the entire time. 31 years. That's how long he wore it without knowing what it said. Every morning, every night. Doing the dishes, sleeping in a shelter cot, walking to the day labor office in the cold. He wore it because it was the only thing he had when he woke up without a past. He wore it because it felt like his. He wore it because somewhere in the part of him that memory couldn't reach, he already knew it was. He just couldn't read it. On the morning of September 4th, 1992, a man was found unconscious behind a gas station on the east side of Tulsa, Oklahoma. No wallet, no phone, no ID of any kind. He was wearing a gray flannel shirt, brown trousers, and a gold watch on his left wrist. That was the complete inventory of his life. He was taken to St. Francis Hospital. Severe head trauma, 2 cracked ribs. Someone had hurt this man with serious intent. 2 days later, he opened his eyes. A nurse named Angela Dowd was the first face he saw. She leaned in and asked, "Sir, can you hear me? Do you know your name?" He looked at her for a long time, not confused, not panicked. Empty. The way a room looks when someone has cleared it out completely. He said, "I don't know." Not, "Give me a second." Not, "It's on the tip of my tongue." Just, "I don't know." Angela Dowd gave him a name that morning. She called him John. The official report called him Tulsa Doe. And for the next 31 years, from 1992 to 2023, that's who he was. A man with no past, living forward from a gas station parking lot, wearing a dead man's name on his wrist. Except the man wasn't dead. Here is what I need you to hold on to. He had the answer the entire time. He wore it every day. He just couldn't read it. Before we go back to that gas station, before we trace the 31 years that followed, we need to understand who this man was, because that's the part that makes this story unbearable in the best possible way. Leonard Carr was born in 1937 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, second of 3 children. Parents were both school teachers. He grew up modest and quiet, a man who believed that showing up was a form of love. He studied accounting, married young, had 1 daughter, named her Diana, worked 30 years at the same accounting firm in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, never missed a day. In 1985, after 25 years of service, the firm gave him a retirement gift, a gold Timex watch. On the back, they had it engraved, 4 words, a dash, a year, LC, 25 years, 1985. Leonard wore that watch every single day. He said it reminded him that showing up mattered. His wife, Margaret, died in 1988, cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. Leonard was never quite the same. His daughter Diana would say later that he lost a certain brightness after Margaret died. He remarried in 1990. It didn't hold. By late 1991, the second marriage was falling quietly apart. In February 1992, Leonard Carr was 55 years old, divorced, or nearly, grieving in that long, slow way that doesn't announce itself. He was scheduled for an accounting conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He drove there on February 12th. He was never seen again. Diana Walsh was 27 years old when her father disappeared. She was living in Philadelphia, working, building a life. She called her father every Sunday. He always answered. The Sunday after his conference, February 16th, she called and he didn't answer. She called again Monday, Tuesday. Wednesday, she called the Tulsa hotel. The clerk told her, "Mr. Carr checked out on February 13th. He hadn't checked out. His suitcase was still in the room, his passport, his coat. The hotel had assumed he'd simply left things behind. It happens sometimes with conference guests. Diana called the Tulsa police. She told them, "My father was at a conference in Tulsa. He was supposed to be home 4 days ago, and I can't reach him. Something is wrong." The police filed a missing persons report. They found his rental car in the hotel parking garage, untouched. No signs of struggle. No note. The working theory, delivered to Diana with the polite detachment of someone who handles these calls often: he left voluntarily. Divorce stress, depression, a man who needed to disappear for a while. Diana said, "My father would not do that. He would not leave without telling me. He would not do that." But there was no evidence of anything else. Weeks passed. Months. The file stayed open, but the active search ended. On a cold Saturday in October 1992, Diana Walsh stood in the community room of her father's church in Harrisburg and said a few words at a memorial service for a man with no grave. She was 27 years old. She kept her voice steady until she sat down. Then she didn't. She would carry that particular grief for the next 31 years. Not the grief of loss, the grief of not knowing, which is a different and much heavier thing. February 12th, 1992. Leonard attends the first day of the conference. Colleagues see him at dinner. He seems quiet, fine, the way people look when they are holding something and have gotten very good at it. February 13th. Morning sessions, lunch. He is seen. After that, nothing. His rental car is found in the hotel garage on February 14th, Valentine's Day, by a parking attendant who notices it hasn't moved. No signs of forced entry, no blood, nothing disturbed. Just a car that had been there too long. 6 months pass. Diana Walsh files updates to the missing persons report. She calls the Tulsa detective every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, the detective says the same thing. Nothing new. And then, on September 4th, 1992, 6 months and 21 days after Leonard Carr walks out of the Tulsa Conference Hotel for the last time, an unconscious man is found behind a gas station on the east side of the city. Same city, 6 months later. Gold watch on his wrist. The Tulsa police run his fingerprints. No match in the 1992 database. They cross-reference recent missing persons reports. They do not pull up Leonard Carr's file because Leonard Carr's report is 6 months old and was filed under a different division. 1992, before digital integration. Before interconnected databases, before the question could find its answer in the same room. So Tulsa Doe, John, enters the system, and Leonard Carr is quietly, gradually, presumed dead. Let's slow down here, because this is the part that most people don't think about when they imagine a story like this. It's one thing to say, a man lost his identity and lived 31 years without one. It's another thing to understand what that actually looks like, day to day, year to year. Tulsa Doe, John, was discharged from St. Francis Hospital after 6 weeks. Brain damage confirmed. Retrograde amnesia. Permanent. The memories before that gas station were not hidden. They were not sleeping somewhere, waiting to be unlocked by the right trigger. They were structurally gone. The neurologist explained this carefully, and John listened without visible emotion. He asked, "So there's no chance they come back?" The neurologist said, "We can't say with absolute certainty. But the damage pattern suggests the memories aren't suppressed, they're not there to retrieve. John nodded slowly. He said, "All right." And he meant it, not as resignation, as acknowledgement. He was a man who had always been practical. He just didn't know that about himself yet. Without a social security number, John could not legally work. Without a birth certificate, he could not get a driver's license. Without ID, he could not open a bank account, access government benefits, rent an apartment in his own name, or exist in any official sense. He washed dishes at a diner on South Tulsa. Cash. He did landscaping through a day labor agency. Cash. He lived in shelters, slept in charity housing, ate at food banks. When people asked his name, he said John. When they asked his last name, he said he didn't have one. Most people let it go. Here's the first thing that should make you stop and sit with this. In 1997, 5 years into his life as John Doe, he walked into a public library in Tulsa and sat down at a microfiche reader. The librarian asked what he was looking for. He said, obituaries. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 1992 to 1997. She asked, any particular name? He said, no, I don't know the name. I keep dreaming about Harrisburg. I thought if I was from there, someone might have put something in the paper when I went missing. The librarian helped him thread the film. He spent 3 hours going through 5 years of Harrisburg obituaries. He found nothing. Because there was no obituary for Leonard Carr. Leonard Carr had no grave and no death certificate. He had been listed as a missing person. John was looking for the record of his own death. The record didn't exist because he wasn't dead. He was sitting at that microfiche reader, in that library, holding the film cartridge, looking for himself. He drove home. Someone gave him a ride, he couldn't drive legally, and told no one what he'd found. Which was nothing. Which was everything. Angela Dowd had been a nurse at St. Francis for 22 years when John Doe arrived in her ward. She had named a lot of patients things she'd never thought about again. John was different. She checked on him after his discharge, informally, the way certain nurses do when a case gets under their skin. She'd see him in the neighborhood. She'd make sure he was eating. She brought him books from the library. She never asked him to remember anything. She just sat with him sometimes on the low wall outside the shelter and talked about ordinary things. What she noticed over years was this: he didn't fit. She said it this way, not in a bad way, not in the way you might think if you picture a homeless man. He was always the most composed person in any room. He listened carefully. He used words precisely. He remembered things people told him, not about himself, but about them. He was the kind of man that, if you met him at a dinner party, you'd have thought, that man has had an interesting career. She started asking him small things. Did he recognize certain words? Did he know what accounts payable meant, what amortization meant? He told her, I know what they mean. I don't know why I know. She wrote it down in a personal notebook she kept for years about his case. Financial vocabulary, comfort with numbers, methodical thinking, strong literacy, professional background, she wrote, probably significant. She didn't know what to do with that, but she kept the notebook because she had a feeling, a nurse's feeling, the kind that has no evidence and turns out to be right, that someday it would matter. In 2018, Angela Dowd retired. She packed her desk, drove home, and sat in her kitchen for a long time. Then she called the shelter where John was still living. She said, "Tell John that Angela called. Tell him I'm still out here." The message was delivered. John smiled when he heard it. The shelter counselor said it was one of the only times she'd seen him smile without something specific prompting it. In 2004, 12 years in, a social worker named Gordon Nash took on John Doe's case. Nash worked for a Tulsa nonprofit that helped people navigate the legal gray zones of identity. Undocumented persons, people with no birth records, people who had, for various reasons, fallen entirely out of the official system. People exactly like John. Nash said it this way: "When I first met him, I thought, this man should not be sitting here, not in this office, not in this situation. He was too composed, too careful with language. He wasn't a man who had always lived this way. He was a man who had fallen into it. That's different. You can tell." Nash spent 2 years trying to build a legal identity for John Doe the hard way. Application to the Social Security Administration for an exemption case, denied. Petition for a late-issued birth certificate with no state of origin established, denied. Attempt to get a non-driver state ID through Oklahoma DMV. Needed 2 prior documents to begin the chain. He had none. The legal system, Nash realized, was designed entirely for people who already existed inside it. If you fell out, truly fell out with no thread remaining, there was no door back in. But Nash noticed something. During their paperwork sessions, the applications, the appeals, the endless forms, John would sometimes reach for Nash's documents and begin organizing them. Not shuffling, organizing. Dates aligned, totals checked, columns sorted without being asked. Nash said, "I asked him, 'Did you used to work with numbers?' He looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. He said, 'I don't know. I just noticed they were out of order. I can't help it.'" Nash added a note to the case file. Possible professional background, accounting or finance. He had no idea how close he was. In 2009, John Doe was 17 years into his invisible life when he was briefly hospitalized for a respiratory infection. During the intake process, a nurse asked him to remove his watch for an IV line. He handed it over. The nurse glanced at it, then looked closer. She said, "There's something engraved on the back here. Have you ever read it?" John took the watch back. He turned it over. He had looked at the back before over the years. Naturally, you would. But the engraving had always been too worn, the light never quite right, the letters too faded to resolve into meaning. Under the examination room's fluorescent light, squinting, tilting the watch at an angle, he made out 4 shapes. L, C, then a dash, then 2 numbers, 25 and something, then a year, 1985. He stared at it for a long time. He said quietly, "LC. I wonder if that's me." He told Gordon Nash about it at their next meeting. Nash added it to the file. LC, possible initials, possible retirement gift. Pre-1985 employment, possibly 25 years of service. They had no idea what to do with it. Initials and a year. Without a name, it was a key with no lock. It was everything, and it was nothing. Before we get to how he was found, there's a question you've been carrying since the beginning of this story. We need to answer it here. What happened to Leonard Carr during those 6 months? February 14th to September 4th, 132 days, unaccounted for. John Doe has no memory of it. He never will. But Victoria Reed, the genealogist who eventually cracks his case, digs into the historical record. She finds a Salvation Army intake log from March 1992. A man matching Leonard's description gave his name as Lee, refused to give a surname, stayed 3 nights. A day labor record from May 1992. A man named Leonard Carr, close enough to suggest this was real, not coincidence, worked 4 days on a landscaping crew. Cash paid. No address on file. Nothing after that until September. The theory, supported by the medical evidence, is this. Leonard Carr suffered a mental health crisis in mid-February 1992, likely triggered by the accumulation of everything: the divorce, the long grief for Margaret, the isolation of the conference. A man at the edge of something who finally stepped off. He left the hotel on his own. He did not go to the airport. He did not call anyone. He wandered. He lived on the streets of the city he had come to for a conference. For 5 months he survived, barely, by the margins, without seeking help. In September, he was assaulted. Robbery, most likely. Beaten severely. Left behind the gas station. The assault caused the head trauma. The head trauma caused the amnesia. A man who was already half lost became permanently so on one September night. We don't know who assaulted him. The case is 30 years old. The evidence is gone. We may never know. But here's what matters. He survived. In one of the harder ways a person can survive something, without knowing it, without being able to call anyone, without being able to say, I need help. I am Leonard Carr. My daughter's phone number is this. He survived, and he wore the watch. And 31 years later, someone finally turned it over. In 2012, a nonprofit called the DNA Doe Project began forming around a single idea. Take DNA from unidentified persons, upload to genealogy databases, find family matches, build family trees backward until the identity resolves. It had worked for Jane Does, for murder victims, for people missing for decades. In 2020, a volunteer genealogist named Victoria Reed read a small note buried in a Tulsa newspaper article about the city's unhoused population. The note said, "One of Tulsa's longest remaining John Does has lived without identity for 28 years. He asks only to be called John." Victoria Reed contacted the shelter through the DNA Doe Project. She explained what the process involved: a cheek swab, a database upload, a search. She told him it might not work. She told him even if it did, what she found might be complicated. He said, "I want to know, even if what I find is bad. 30 years of not knowing is worse than anything I could find out." Victoria collected the DNA sample in spring 2021. She uploaded it to GEDmatch. 48 hours later, matches. Not close ones, not a child or a sibling, distant matches. Second and third cousins. People who share great-grandparents with John Doe without knowing his name. While Victoria was building the family tree in her home office, John was 3 miles away in the shelter, reading a paperback someone had left in the common room. He didn't know anyone was looking for him. He had stopped expecting anyone to look for him approximately 20 years earlier. He just read his book and wore his watch and waited for Tuesday, when the shelter served the soup he preferred. Victoria spent 6 weeks climbing. That's the word genealogists use. You climb up the family tree as far as records allow, then come back down the other side, branching, mapping, eliminating names one by one until only one is left. Victoria had done this on 43 prior cases. This one, she said later, was different. She said, I usually end up with a pool of 10 to 15 candidates. With this case, I got to a point where there was exactly one person it could be. And when I looked up that person, I sat at my desk and said the name out loud, because I needed to hear it, because I needed it to be real before I made the call. The name she said was Leonard Carr. Missing Persons Report filed February 16, 1992. Last seen, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Reported by Diana Walsh, age 27. Relationship, daughter. Victoria cross-referenced the date of disappearance, February 1992, with the date John was found, September 1992. Same city, 6 months apart. She cross-referenced the age estimate from the 1992 hospital intake, mid to late 50s. Leonard Carr was 55 in February 1992. She looked at the watch engraving note in Gordon Nash's old case file. LC. 25 years. 1985. Leonard Carr. 25 years of service. Retirement gift, 1985. In October 2023, a detective working cold case follow-ups for the DNA Doe Project dialed a number in Philadelphia. Diana Walsh was 58 years old. She had long since stopped expecting that number to ring about her father. She had, over 31 years, made a kind of peace with it. Not real peace, the kind that exists because you can't survive without it. The detective said, Ms. Walsh, I'm calling about your father, Leonard Carr, the missing persons report you filed in February of 1992. Diana later said the moment she heard those words, the missing persons report you filed in 1992, she went completely still. 31 years. No one had ever called about that report. She said, Is there a body? Did they find... The detective said, No, Ms. Walsh. Your father is alive. He's in Tulsa. Silence on the line. She said, That's not possible. My father has been gone for 31 years. The detective said, I understand. The DNA is confirmed. The man who has been living as a John Doe in Tulsa since 1992 is Leonard Carr. We need you to come to Tulsa. Diana Walsh sat down on her kitchen floor. She said later she didn't choose to sit down. Her legs simply decided. That night, she called her father's sister. Irene Sutherland was 80 years old and lived in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She had spent 31 years carrying the specific grief of a missing brother, the kind that has no grave, no marker, no clear end. Diana told her, Aunt Irene, they found Dad. He's alive. He's been in Tulsa the whole time. A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Irene asked, Does he remember us? Diana said, No. He has amnesia. He doesn't know who we are. Another silence. And then Irene Sutherland said, Does he still have the watch? Before the reunion, Victoria Reed arranged to record a short interview with John Doe. She wanted him to speak for himself, to describe the experience in his own words before the family arrived and the world got complicated. He sat in a small office at the shelter on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He was 86 years old. He wore the watch. Victoria asked, What has it been like, not knowing? He said, I used to think the not knowing was the worst part. Then, after a while, you realize the worst part is the certainty. You become certain you had a life. You become certain there were people who knew you. But you can't reach them because you don't know their names. It's like having a room in your house you can't open. You know something is in there. You can feel it. But the door has no handle. She asked about the watch. He said, "I've had it my entire conscious life. Since I woke up in the hospital in 1992, it was on my wrist. I kept it because it felt like mine, because it was the only thing I had that might mean something. I couldn't read the engraving properly. The back was too worn. I just kept it. Because in 1992, it was everything I owned." She asked if he was afraid of what the reunion might be. He said, "I'm 86 years old, and I've been alive for 31 years. If there was another version of me before that, a man named Leonard who had a daughter and a sister and a firm in Harrisburg, I want to know him, even if he's a stranger, even if we have nothing left in common. I want to know what he was like." She asked, "What if the family finds it hard?" He said, "Then I'll apologize to them, and I'll mean it." Diana Walsh and Irene Sutherland flew to Tulsa on October 14, 2023. They were taken to a community room at the shelter. Victoria Reed was there. Angela Dowd, 71 years old, long retired, who had driven down from her home north of the city the moment she heard the news, was also there. She had waited 31 years for this without knowing she was waiting. John Doe was already in the room when Diana and Irene walked in. He stood when he saw them, not because he recognized them, because he was a man who had been raised 55 years before this moment to stand when someone walked into a room. Some things live below memory, deeper than memory. They live in the body. Diana Walsh walked toward him. She was carrying a manila envelope. She stopped a few feet away and just looked at him for a long time. He looked back. She said, "I brought photographs. I thought, maybe if you saw them?" She laid them on the table between them. A young man at a university graduation. A man and a woman on their wedding day, her dress catching the light. A man holding a newborn baby, his whole face taken over by something that looked like terrified joy. A little girl on a bicycle. A man's hand on the back of the seat, steadying her. John Doe looked at the photographs for a long time. His face was completely still. Diana said, "Dad, it's me. It's Diana, your daughter." He said, "I'm sorry. I don't remember having a daughter. I'm so sorry." Irene Sutherland stepped forward. She was 80 years old and her hands were shaking. She said, "Leonard, Tommy, I'm Irene, your sister. We grew up together in Scranton. You taught me to ride a bike, the summer you were 11 and I was 8, the alley behind Mum's house. You held the back of the seat until I yelled at you to let go." He looked at the photograph, the little girl on the bicycle. He looked at Irene. He said, "I don't remember. I'm very sorry. I wish I could remember. I don't." Diana was crying. Irene was not. Irene just looked at her brother with an expression that carried 31 years of everything, grief and relief, and something that had no name because human beings don't experience it often enough to name it. Then Irene said quietly, "Can I see your watch?" John looked down at his wrist. He unclasped the watch and handed it to Irene. Irene turned it over. She held it close to her face, the way an 80-year-old woman holds something she wants desperately to read. She stood there for a moment. Then she passed it to Diana without a word. Diana Walsh took the watch. Under the fluorescent light of that community room, she could make out the inscription clearly. L.C. 25 years, 1985. She looked at the man sitting across from her. She looked at the watch. She set it down on the table between them very gently, face up. She said, "You've been wearing your name on your wrist for 31 years. He looked at the watch. He looked at her. And for the first time in that room, something crossed his face that none of them could entirely name. Not recognition, not memory. Something that lived in a different place than either of those things. Something that looked, from a certain angle, like the beginning of grief for a man he could not remember being. Diana put the watch back on the table. John picked it up. He put it back on his wrist. Some things you keep even when you finally know what they mean. After the reunion, a pro bono attorney working with Victoria Reed and the DNA Doe Project filed the necessary petitions with Oklahoma and Pennsylvania. The process took 4 months. In February 2024, a man who had not officially existed for 31 years received a Social Security number. For the first time since 1992, Leonard Carr existed on paper. He was eligible for benefits he had never been able to access. He could open a bank account. He could see a doctor without paying cash from charity funds. He could, for the first time in 31 years, be counted. But he asked everyone around him to keep calling him John. He said, "I understand I am legally Leonard Carr. I accept that completely. I want those rights. But I have been John for 31 years. John is the person I know how to be. Leonard is someone I can read about. I can know what he was like. But I can't feel him from the inside. John is where I live." Diana Walsh accepted this. It took her a while. She said, "I have my father's body back, his face, his hands. He still stands up when someone walks into a room, because apparently that's in him somewhere below everything else. But the man who taught me to drive, who sat with me at my mother's funeral, who called every Sunday, that man isn't there anymore. And I had to make a choice. I could spend the rest of his life grieving the version I lost, or I could show up for the version that's here. I chose to show up. I don't regret it." Irene Sutherland visited her brother 4 times that first year. She never pressed him to remember. She just told him stories. Their parents, the house in Scranton, the alley where she learned to ride a bike. Not to restore memory, because she wanted him to know who he had been. She said, "He can't remember it, but he can know it. Those are different things. I can't give him his memories back, but I can give him his story. That's still something. That's not nothing." Angela Dowd came to see him shortly after the reunion. She sat across from the man she had named 31 years ago in a hospital ward. She held his hand and said she was glad he'd been found. He thanked her for calling him John all those years. He said, "It's a good name. It's plain. But it held me." Angela Dowd nodded. She didn't trust herself to say anything else. There is a question at the center of this story that no DNA result, no legal document, no neurologist's report can answer. Who is this man? He is, legally, Leonard Carr, father, brother, accountant, husband, a man with 55 years of history before his first conscious memory. He is, experientially, John, the man who woke up in Tulsa with nothing but a gold watch and the name a nurse gave him. The man who built a small, careful life out of whatever he could reach. If memory is what makes us who we are, if the self is the continuous thread of remembered experience, then Leonard Carr ended behind that gas station in September 1992, and John began. But Leonard Carr's daughter is real. His sister is real. The engraving is real. The 30 years of service and the retirement gift and the marriage and the grief and the February night when something finally broke, all of it is real. It was real before John knew it existed. It shaped the man John woke up being, even if John couldn't see it. Some people who've heard this story say John should have fought to reclaim Leonard completely. The legal name, the family, the history, all of it fully inhabited, not held at arm's length. Others say what he chose was the only honest thing a person in his position could do, that you cannot perform a self you don't feel, that identity isn't assigned, it's lived. I'll let you decide. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land. He was asked about this directly, before the comments, before the debate, before anyone else had an opinion about his life. Just him in a small shelter office wearing the watch. He said, "I think about whether the man who wore this watch for 55 years and the man who found himself wearing it in a hospital are the same person. I don't know, but I think we owe each other something." He kept the watch without knowing why. I got to find out why. Maybe that's what continuity looks like when memory is gone. You carry things forward without knowing what they mean. And eventually, if you're lucky, someone tells you. Leonard Carr, John, is 86 years old as of this script. He lives in Tulsa. He does not want to move. He says Tulsa is the only home he has ever known. He is not wrong. Diana Walsh visits 3 times a year. She stopped waiting for him to recognize her. She shows up anyway. That is, she has decided, enough. Irene Sutherland still sends letters, long ones, full of Scranton and the names of people who are mostly gone now. He reads every one. He writes back, not as a man who remembers, as a man who is listening. Victoria Reed has since identified 14 more unidentified persons. She says this case changed the way she looks at every new one. She said, "The details that seem too small to matter are always the ones that matter most." A watch, an engraving, 4 letters worn almost to nothing. Cases teach you to look at everything as if it could be the answer, because sometimes it already is. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know what this channel is. Every story here is someone who got forgotten, someone who fell through the gap, someone the world stopped looking for. We don't stop looking. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.